You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
Kroal is AI built for the enterprise SOC, fully private, schema-free, and capable of running in sensitive air-gapped environments. Kroal autonomously investigates thousands of alerts weekly, correlating insights across your tools without data leaving your perimeter. Designed for high availability across geographies, it delivers context-aware, auditable decisions aligned to your workflows. Kroal empowers analysts to act faster and focus on critical threats, replacing repetitive triage with intelligent automation to help your SOC operate at scale with precision and control. Learn more at Kroal.com. That's Krogl.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CyberWire's Research Saturday. I'm Dave Bittner, and this is our weekly conversation with researchers and analysts tracking down the threats and vulnerabilities, solving some of the hard problems, and protecting ourselves in a rapidly evolving cyberspace. Thanks for joining us.
If an application is vulnerable to this abuse, basically, if I know like a legitimate user's email address that uses that CS application, there's a way I can set that email address in my own sort of attacker entry tenant, and then authenticate essentially into the CS application, as the legitimate user. So, whether you want to call it spoofing or impersonation, right? The end result is I'm in that CS application as that user and have access to, whatever they would have access to in that application.
That's Eric Woodruff, Chief Identity Architect at Sempris. The research we're discussing today is titled nOAuth Abuse Alert, Full Account Takeover of Entra Cross-Tenant SaaS Applications. Can you walk us through how you went through this testing to see if your suspicions were correct?
So it actually there was a confluence of some other research that we're doing in the Entra App Gallery, which is kind of like a catalog of application integrations. So I had read the research that Dscope had performed, back in 2023, and like what they published and some of the other stuff MSRC published at the time as well. The Entra Application Gallery sort of made a nice way to find, applications that use OpenID Connect, right? And so this is another sort of core requirement, is that they're OpenID Connect applications. Yeah, I just started poking at a few, kind of going down the list, as boring as maybe that sounds. And I happened to find one that was susceptible. So I just kept chugging away through the rest of the list that are in the Entra App Gallery.
Can you walk us through how that works? I mean, how do you go about doing that, and also making sure that what you're doing is ethical, and also you're putting guardrails on yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, in the testing that we're performing, right, to make sure I'm staying within, the boundaries of ethics, the only applications we tested were ones that I could sign up for, like, a service as myself, right? So at the time we were testing, there was like 1,017 OpenID Connect applications, and I found like about 104 of them, right? I could go sign up for like a trial or, sign in as myself, right? So I'm the legitimate user, right, so to speak, in that application. And then, I would try to create some sort of like bit of data, right, to sort of make sure I could act as like a legitimate customer of the app. And then I had a separate Entra tenant where I was the attacker, right? But in this whole scenario, I'm only going after myself, so to speak, right? So I'm not actually trying to get access to something like I shouldn't have.
Sure. So what kinds of applications did you find were most vulnerable here?
So, I mean, it's, a small smattering of applications. that were vulnerable. There was a few systems that had PII, right? So there was a HR, platform. If you think of something like Workday, now Workday wasn't one, to be clear, but we're talking a platform like that. There's a few like collaboration platforms, like you think of platforms where you might do mind mapping and diagram sharing and other sort of like business collaboration. There's a few that also still actually are vulnerable, so we've been sensitive to not actually really talk about what they are. But another one that, well, I'd say mid-June when I last checked, that was still vulnerable, also contained PII that would be similar to like stuff you'd find in like an HR application. Out of the 9, there wasn't anything that was necessarily, I'd say, consistent. Across like the vertical or type of software it is or whatnot.
Right. And you rated this vulnerability as being severe. What led you to that category?
Well, I think because the attack itself, right, it's already essentially documented, right, by Dscope when they published. And then obviously, like when we published, right, if you're technical, right, you'd be able to read our findings and also, right, sort of figure out how it works. If you're a technical person and you know of a vulnerable application, right, it's a relatively easy attack to pull off. It's easy to get access to an Entra tenant. It's easy to basically follow the steps to replicate it. Obviously, you need to know of an application that is vulnerable, right? So that is the sort of wild card here. But if you did happen to have an app that was vulnerable, not only is it easy to pull off, but it's, as we say, near impossible to sort of detect. And, the customer really can't do anything to mitigate it.
And is that because, well, explain to me why that is.
So, from the mitigation perspective, right, all the traditional stuff one might use to try to protect applications in their Entra tenant, like conditional access and maybe, asking for multi-factor or phishing resistant auth, all these common things, or maybe they're using a cloud app security broker, CASB solution that's looking at the traffic. Right, the attacker is coming in essentially out of band, right? So the attacker is in a completely different Entra tenant. So nothing that you can do within your own Entra tenant from a traditional perspective is going to help really mitigate things. The only thing you're really left then from a detection perspective is log correlation, right? So the theory would be, well, I can take all my Entra sign-in logs and I can take all my SaaS application sign-in logs and kind of cross-correlate them, right? And basically look for SaaS application sign-ins where there isn't a matching Entra sign-in. But that theory is great. In reality, that is difficult to impossible with SaaS apps, primarily because a lot of SaaS applications offer very poor logging capabilities, right, for sign-in events. And even ones that do, they don't really have a way to easily integrate that stuff into like a SIM, like Sentinel or Splunk or something, right? So again, the organization that's kind of right stuck in the middle between Microsoft and the vulnerable SaaS app, that's their only detection, and it's nothing I've ever seen anyone actually doing out in the real world. So that's why we say it's like almost next to impossible to detect.
Well, you mentioned in the research that the true mitigations lie with the app vendors themselves. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, ultimately, in both Microsoft's response, right, is that this is developers following anti-patterns in how they implement OpenID Connect in their application. So, not to get too like in the nerdy weeds here, but within OpenID Connect, there is like a unique string that's generated that the identity provider, so Entra, can like guarantee that string is, Dave, right? So the application can say, hey, as long as I'm always getting this string in the ID token that's sent from Entra, I can guarantee that this is Dave and it's not anyone else. The problem comes in where app vendors might not implement OpenID Connect that way, and instead they may say, oh, I'm just going to look at Dave's email address, right? And as long as I'm getting Dave's email, then I know this is Dave, right? But the problem becomes in the Entra world, you can't guarantee that the actual email address being sent is verified by the person who's, saying they own it, so to speak. So that's where, right, like the app vendor is not following OpenID Connect specifications. And this isn't just a Microsoft thing, right? This is actually in the spec where they say to use the unique string, which is called a subject, right? So you kind of have this architected scenario, so to speak, where because Microsoft allows email to not have to be necessarily, verified, that these two things come together to sort of create the vulnerability in the SaaS app.
We'll be right back. Did you know Active Directory is targeted in 9 out of 10 cyber attacks? Once attackers get in, they can take control of your entire network. That's why Sempris created Purple Knight, the free security assessment tool that scans your Active Directory for hundreds of vulnerabilities and shows you how to fix them. Join thousands of IT pros using Purple Knight to stay ahead of threats. Download it now at sempris.com/purple-night. That's sempris.com/purple-night. Hey everybody, Dave here. I've talked about DeleteMe before, and I'm still using it because it still works. It's been a few months now, and I'm just as impressed today as I was when I signed up. DeleteMe keeps finding and removing my personal information from data broker sites, and they keep me updated with detailed reports, so I know exactly what's been taken down. I'm genuinely relieved knowing my privacy isn't something I have to worry about every day. The DeleteMe team handles everything. It's the set it and forget it peace of mind. And it's not just for individuals. DeleteMe also offers solutions for businesses, helping companies protect their employees' personal information and reduce exposure to social engineering and phishing threats. And right now, our listeners get a special deal, 20% off your DeleteMe plan. Just go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and use promo code N2K at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/N2K, code N2K. And is there no way for the user to know whether or not the provider is properly configuring things?
Yeah, so unfortunately, right, the user is stuck in the middle. Unless you were to say, go test the application for the vulnerability, there's no way as a user or an enterprise with users to know that the app is vulnerable. Now, again, right, Microsoft argues there might be legitimate reasons that they want the email address, right? And kind of is like, that's why we're not going to stop sending it as an option if SaaS applications want it, right? Because say, right, I go sign into a SaaS app and they say want to actually send me an email, right? Well, this makes it easier because we already know the person's, email address. I'd counter some of those arguments with, I think Microsoft could do more to potentially put something on the app integration so that customers could be aware that the app is asking for email. Right. This would be something more like that an enterprise IT could use to, determine, hey, if there's maybe some risk here. But, unfortunately, Microsoft hasn't really said much about these I guess, ideas that we had when we opened the case with them, right? Again, it's not an absolute. It's not going to say, yes, definitively this application is vulnerable, because ultimately you don't know what the application is doing with the email address until you actually authenticate to it. But it can at least sort of surface to organizations, right? Hey, these applications are asking for this. Maybe we should talk to the application vendor and make sure, that they're implementing OpenID Connect correctly.
Right.
Sorry, I'm getting a bit soapboxy there, but
that's okay. You've earned it. So you mentioned in the research that you did responsible disclosure to Microsoft, but also some of these SaaS vendors.
Yep.
What sort of reaction did you get from them?
Yeah, so the vendors, it was a bit of a mixed bag, which I think is interesting and maybe sad in itself. As a positive, we had one vendor who we contacted, and within a week they resolved it, and it was a great experience, I'd say. So I don't want to sound completely negative in that. This vendor, we got a hold of their data protection officer, explained the problem, had some back and forth emails. They implemented a fix. They asked us to test again. We found there was still a vulnerability, and then they said, "Oh yeah, like our application is sort of geographically deployed." So they fixed it in another region, and then everything was buttoned up there. And I would love to use them, and I've been talking with them. I hope we can maybe sort of disclose at some point who they are, so it can kind of be like a good case of working through this in a positive way. But other vendors, yeah, it was difficult to find who to contact, right? And so the mix would be like, well, either going on their website and looking at, security or privacy or data protection policies, and or, just opening support cases, and or just trying to spam, security at, companydomain.com. And some of them, we'd open a support case and it was open for like months, and then we'd get a little more, well, I don't want to say aggressive, right? But like, hey, this is a pretty critical problem in your app, right? In theory, if I know who any of your customers are, I could get into their data. And yeah, some of the vendors, there's no response from them right back to that. There's two of the ones that we found that are still vulnerable, again, last that I checked. So.
Do you suppose that a vendor who's been alerted to this, is there a way for them behind the scenes to see if it's under active exploitation?
I guess it probably depends on their app and how it's built and what they log and what they don't log, right? So again, it's such a mixed bag, right? You don't know how they're capturing the ID token or what attribute data they're pulling out of it, right? They may or may not be able to. I mean, ultimately, right, if they went into some sort of, debug process looking for this problem, yes, they should know it's potentially being exploited. However, ultimately, I think their focus should be more on just fixing the problem, right? Because they could say, oh, well, it's not actively being exploited, but unless they actually change their code, right? Say they're not following OpenID Connect spec, there's nothing that would prevent someone from theoretically exploiting it, at some point down the road.
Right. Looking at the big picture here, I mean, what does this say about the potential gap between these identity standards and their real-world implementations?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? And it's probably filled with a lot of opinions that are subjective. I mean, I will say, right, authentication is tough, and I'm an identity nerd, and if I'm doing OAuth flows or OpenID Connect stuff, I mean, I still have to go look at the diagrams and be like, how is this supposed to work again, right? And I get that modern authentication is tough, and you can't expect every developer, right, to be an expert in authentication, but at the same time, I sort of have a personal grudge, I'd say, against the cybersecurity industry in the way we educate, folks around authentication and identity. If you go look at a lot of the education and, the focus on cybersecurity these days, there isn't a lot that tries to get into identity and authentication and, things like OpenID Connect. And again, it's very, dry and boring on one hand. And if you just let me start talking about it, probably everyone listening would fall asleep. But right, it is so important, obviously, that people understand how this stuff works. And yeah, I mean, it definitely says something about the industry, right? That there's this disconnect with the standards and how they're implemented. But also, I think there's a big educational gap and a gap in the focus, right, on how we're building up, people's knowledge around this.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, whose responsibility do you suppose this is? I mean, does this come down to the standards groups or folks like Microsoft who are implementing? It doesn't seem like the users are to blame here.
Yeah, right. I mean, in this one, absolutely not. There's the users just kind of caught in the middle. I mean, this thing in particular, I will say, is, well, unfortunately unique because It's kind of like Microsoft has architected themselves into a bit of a predicament with it, right? Because the standards writers, again, I'm not in their mind, right, when they wrote OpenID Connect. I mean, going on over a decade now, right? Microsoft sort of took the spec and they've implemented some unique qualities that allow you to have multi-tenant apps, right? So, Microsoft and Google, right, they're kind of the only two big authentication providers, right, where you can go to some website and there's a, sign in with Microsoft, sign in with Google. I mean, on consumer apps, there might also be like a sign in with Facebook. But if we're really just focused on enterprise, right, they're the two where you can have that, sign in with Office 365. And it doesn't matter, kind of where your Entra ID that's underlying that stuff lives, right? And Google similar. And I'm not a Google expert, so I don't know how they implement things, but it's kind of like, again, this confluence of the standard plus Microsoft building this multi-tenant architecture thing. And then you sprinkle in, right, this ability to have unverified email addresses creates like the perfect storm essentially for the nOAuth attack. That's why, like, if you went and looked at something like Okta or whatnot that doesn't have this sort of concept of multi-tenancy, right, it wouldn't be, vulnerable to this, again, just because of the way it's architected. So,
yeah. So what are your recommendations then? What do you hope folks take away from the research?
Well, I mean, big picture, right? Like, I hope that it's created some noise potentially so that developers, right, go look at their code. And again, if an app vendor is not properly implementing OpenID Connect, that they think about it again twice, right? Because right, end of the day, they don't, I would think, want their customers to be a target, right? Because the sort of resolution for customers, right, if the vendor doesn't fix it, is to dump that SaaS application. I mean, I would hope that Microsoft maybe thinks about adding some sort of attribute on these applications again, so that customers will at least know that right, this email claim is being used, and or I do think that there's a place where Microsoft could eventually sunset this. Right, there are ways that application developers could get email addresses if they really want them. Right, that don't have to come in this way. And if Microsoft sunset that, it would absolutely resolve this problem within Entra ID. Right, and you know how things go. They could say 2028 or something. Right, we're going to sunset it, and people plenty of time, right, between now and then to sort of change how their apps are implementing
right.
things.
Right, but, and then extend it, Right. Meanwhile, back in the real world. Our thanks to Eric Woodruff from Sempris for joining us. The research is titled nOAuth Abuse Alert, Full Account Takeover of Entra Cross-Tenant SaaS Applications. We'll have a link in the show notes. That is Research Saturday, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. We'd love to hear from you. We're conducting our annual audience survey to learn more about our listeners. We're collecting your insights through the end of this summer. There's a link in the show notes. Please do check it out. This episode was produced by Liz Stokes. We're mixed by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. Peter Kilpie is our publisher, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time.